You stay on your side of the stage, kid, and I'll stay on mine. Frank Sinatra's words cut through the backstage tension at ABC Studios like a blade through silk, his blue eyes locked on Elvis Presley with the kind of cold fury that had made Las Vegas pit bosses nervous for decades. It was March 26, 1960, and America was about to witness what would be billed as the entertainment event of the decade, the king of rock and roll and the chairman of the board performing together on national television for the first and last time. But what 67 million viewers wouldn't see was the backstage war that had been brewing for 5 years, ever since a skinny kid from Memphis had dared to challenge everything Frank Sinatra represented about American music. What happened in those final moments before the cameras rolled would shock you, divide these two legends forever and create television history that's never been fully told. If you think you know the story of Frank and Elvis, think again, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about that legendary night. Hit that like button if you're ready for the truth, and let me know in the comments, Team Frank or Team Elvis. Let's dive into the real story. The Welcome Home Elvis special had been conceived as a celebration of Elvis's return from military service, but Frank's involvement had turned it into something much more dangerous, a public showdown between two generations, two musical philosophies, and two men who represented completely different versions of American masculinity. Frank had agreed to host the show not out of respect for Elvis, but because he saw an opportunity to put the young upstart in his place on national television. The network executives at ABC had initially approached Frank with the idea as a way to bridge the gap between traditional pop music and the rock and roll revolution that was sweeping America. They believed that having Frank host Elvis's homecoming show would lend credibility to the younger singer while giving Frank an opportunity to show that he could work with contemporary artists. What they hadn't anticipated was that Frank would view the assignment as a chance to publicly humiliate his perceived rival. Frank's resistance to rock and roll wasn't just musical, it was deeply personal. He'd built his career on the idea that entertainment should be sophisticated, adult, and carefully crafted by professionals who'd paid their dues in the business. Elvis represented everything Frank despised about the new music. It was raw instead of polished, emotional instead of intellectual, and worst of all, it connected with audiences in ways that seemed to bypass all the traditional rules of showmanship that Frank had spent 20 years mastering. The announcement of the special had generated enormous media interest, with entertainment reporters speculating about how the two very different stars would work together. Frank's public statements about the show had been diplomatically positive, but privately he'd been planning Elvis's professional execution from the moment he'd signed his contract with ABC. "Listen up, punk," Frank had told Elvis during their first rehearsal meeting earlier that week, his voice carrying the casual menace that came from 20 years of dealing with dangerous men in dangerous places. "This is my show, my network, my rules. You're here because the army made you respectable, but don't forget, I was selling records when you were still wetting your pants in Tupelo." Elvis, dressed in his perfectly pressed military uniform that he'd worn for the publicity photos, had looked Frank directly in the eye with a mixture of respect and defiance that surprised everyone in the room. The young singer had returned from his military service with a new maturity and confidence that hadn't been there during his explosive rise to fame in the mid-50s. His 2 years in the Army hadn't just been about serving his country. They'd been about growing up, learning discipline, and understanding that true strength came not from rebellion but from standing up for yourself when it mattered most. "Mr. Sinatra, I've got nothing but respect for what you've accomplished," Elvis had replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned to command respect without demanding it. "But I didn't serve my country for 2 years just to come home and be treated like some punk kid who doesn't know his place. I know exactly where I stand, and I earned that position." The confrontation had been building since 1955, when Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel had knocked Frank's Love and Marriage off the top of the charts and announced the arrival of a new kind of American music that made Frank's sophisticated swing arrangements sound as dated as a horse and buggy. Frank had publicly dismissed rock and roll as music for delinquents, but privately he understood that Elvis represented an existential threat to everything he'd built. Frank's world was built on sophistication, adult themes, and the kind of musical craftsmanship that required years to master. His success had come through apprenticeship in big bands, learning from masters like Tommy Dorsey, and gradually building a reputation based on technical skill and professional competence. Elvis's world was raw emotion, teenage rebellion, and an energy that connected with audiences in ways that Frank's carefully constructed persona never could. When Frank looked at Elvis, he saw not just a rival but a preview of his own obsolescence. The tension between them had been simmering for 5 years, but it reached a boiling point during the rehearsals for the TV special. Frank had insisted on choosing the songs they would perform together, selecting Love Me Tender for Elvis and Witchcraft for himself. Song choices that were designed to showcase Frank's sophistication while making Elvis look like an amateur trying to sing grown-up music. The selection of Witchcraft was particularly calculated. The song was one of Frank's signature numbers, a sophisticated piece that required subtle phrasing and an understanding of jazz harmonies that Frank assumed Elvis wouldn't possess. By making Elvis attempt to sing it on national television, Frank believed he could expose the younger singer's limitations and prove that rock and roll success didn't translate to real musical ability. "You want me to sing Witchcraft?" Elvis had asked during their first musical rehearsal, his eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. "Mr. Sinatra, that's your song. I wouldn't know how to begin to approach something like that." "That's the point, kid," Frank had replied with a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "America needs to see the difference between a professional entertainer and a flash in the pan who got lucky with a few songs. Sometimes the best way to learn is to fail in public." Elvis, dressed in his perfectly pressed military uniform that he'd worn for the publicity photos, had looked Frank directly in the eye with a mixture of respect and defiance that surprised everyone in the room. "Mr. Sinatra, I've got nothing but respect for what you've accomplished. But I didn't serve my country for 2 years just to come home and be treated like some punk kid who doesn't know his place." The confrontation had been building since 1955, when Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel had knocked Frank's Love and Marriage off the top of the charts and announced the arrival of a new kind of American music that made Frank's sophisticated swing arrangements sound as dated as a horse and buggy. Frank had publicly dismissed rock and roll as music for delinquents, but privately he understood that Elvis represented an existential threat to everything he'd built. Frank's world was built on sophistication, adult themes, and the kind of musical craftsmanship that required years to master. Elvis's world was raw emotion, teenage rebellion, and an energy that connected with audiences in ways that Frank's carefully constructed persona never could. When Frank looked at Elvis, he saw not just a rival but a preview of his own obsolescence. The tension between them had been simmering for 5 years, but it reached a boiling point during the rehearsals for the TV special. Frank had insisted on choosing the songs they would perform together, selecting Love Me Tender for Elvis and Witchcraft for himself, song choices that were designed to showcase Frank's sophistication while making Elvis look like an amateur trying to sing grown-up music. "You want me to sing Witchcraft?" Elvis had asked during their first musical rehearsal, his eyebrows raised in genuine surprise. "Mr. Sinatra, that's your song. I wouldn't know how to begin to approach something like that." "That's the point, kid," Frank had replied with a cold smile. "America needs to see the difference between a professional entertainer and a flash in the pan who got lucky with a few songs." But Elvis had been smarter than Frank had given him credit for. Elvis had been smarter than Frank had given him credit for. The young singer had spent his 2 years in the Army not just serving his country but studying the entertainment business, learning from older performers and developing a sophistication that hadn't been there during his explosive rise to fame in the mid-50s. "Mr. Sinatra," Elvis had said quietly, "if you want to embarrass me on national television, that's your prerogative. But I've got a suggestion that might make for better television. How about you sing Love Me Tender and I'll sing Witchcraft? Give the audience something they've never seen before." Frank's response had been swift and brutal. "Over my dead body, kid. You stick to your guitar and your hip shaking. Leave the real singing to the professionals." The confrontation had escalated from there. with both men bringing their entourages into what became a backstage Cold War. Frank's people, seasoned Vegas professionals who understood power and intimidation, found themselves facing Elvis's team of Southern loyalists who'd grown up protecting their boy from anyone who tried to put him down. Frank's pianist, Bill Miller, had tried to establish musical dominance during rehearsals by making Elvis's arrangements unnecessarily complex, adding jazz chord progressions that were designed to trip up a singer more comfortable with simple blues structures. But Elvis had surprised everyone by not only handling the sophisticated arrangements but improving them with his own musical instincts. "The kid's got ears," Count Basie had whispered to Frank after watching Elvis work through a particularly challenging passage. "Real musical intelligence. He's not just some pretty face with a nice voice." Frank's response had been to double down on his campaign to humiliate Elvis on national television. He'd instructed the show's director to position the cameras in ways that would favor his own performance while making Elvis look awkward and uncomfortable. He'd arranged for the orchestra to play tempos that suited his own vocal style while making Elvis struggle to keep up. But Elvis had been conducting his own campaign behind the scenes. The young singer had been quietly winning over the studio musicians, the camera operators, even the network executives, with a combination of genuine charm and professional competence that contrasted sharply with Frank's increasingly hostile behavior. "That Sinatra's got a real attitude problem," one of the camera operators had confided to Elvis during a break. "Acts like he owns the place. You, on the other hand, actually treat people like human beings." The breaking point had come during the final dress rehearsal the day before the live broadcast. Frank and Elvis were supposed to perform their duet segment, Frank singing Witchcraft to Elvis, then Elvis singing Love Me Tender to Frank, when Frank made a comment that pushed Elvis past his limit. "Try not to embarrass yourself tomorrow night, kid," Frank had said as they finished running through the songs. 67 million people are going to be watching, and I'd hate for them to see what happens when an amateur tries to play with the professionals. Elvis had stopped walking toward his dressing room and turned back to face Frank, his usually polite demeanor replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "Mr. Sinatra, I've been respectful to you since the day I walked into this studio, even though you've been treating me like garbage. But I want you to understand something. Tomorrow night, when we're both on that stage, I'm going to give the best performance of my life. Not to show you up, not to embarrass you, but because that's what the audience deserves. And if you can't match that energy, if you can't bring that same level of commitment, then maybe the audience will figure out for themselves who the real professional is." Frank's response had been immediate and physical. He'd stepped into Elvis's personal space, his hands clenched into fists, his voice dropping to the menacing whisper that had made grown men nervous in Las Vegas back rooms. "You listen to me, you little punk. I was entertaining audiences when you were still sucking your thumb. I've worked with the best musicians in the world. I've performed for presidents. I've built an empire that will last long after your teenage fans grow up and forget your name. Don't you ever question my professionalism again." Elvis hadn't backed down. Instead, he'd stepped closer to Frank, closing the distance between them until they were nose to nose, two of the most famous men in America facing off like street fighters in an alley. "Mr. Sinatra," Elvis had said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute conviction, "I served my country for 2 years. I've dealt with drill sergeants who could eat you for breakfast. You can try to intimidate me all you want, but tomorrow night I'm going to walk out on that stage and show America what I'm made of. And if that threatens you, if that scares you, then maybe you need to ask yourself why." The confrontation had been broken up by their respective managers, but the damage was done. Both men understood that the television special had become more than just an entertainment program. It was going to be a public test of who represented the future of American music and who represented the past. The night of the live broadcast, March 26, 1960, the tension backstage was so thick that even the network executives were nervous. Frank and Elvis had barely spoken to each other during final preparations, communicating only through their managers and the show's producers. Frank's strategy for the live show was to use his superior experience and stage presence to dominate the performance, making Elvis look like an inexperienced amateur who didn't belong on the same stage with a seasoned professional. He'd arranged for the orchestra to play his songs in keys and tempos that favored his vocal style while making Elvis's performance more difficult. But Elvis had developed his own strategy. Instead of trying to compete with Frank's sophistication, he planned to use his natural charisma and emotional honesty to connect with the television audience in ways that Frank's more calculated approach couldn't match. When the cameras rolled and Frank stepped out to introduce Elvis to the American public, his smile was perfectly professional, but his eyes were cold with barely contained hostility. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome home, Elvis Presley," Frank said, his voice carrying just enough sarcasm to let insiders know his real feelings while maintaining the facade of gracious host for the television audience. Elvis's entrance was everything Frank had feared it would be: electric, charismatic, and genuinely exciting in ways that made Frank's introduction seem stiff and outdated by comparison. The studio audience erupted in screams and applause that went on for nearly a full minute, forcing Frank to stand awkwardly beside Elvis, while the younger man acknowledged the crowd's enthusiasm. But it was during their duet segment that the real battle took place. Frank sang Witchcraft directly to Elvis, his performance polished and professional but lacking the warmth and connection that had made him famous in the first place. He was so focused on demonstrating his superiority that he forgot to actually entertain the audience. Elvis's response was masterful. When his turn came to sing "Love Me Tender" to Frank, he didn't try to match Frank's sophistication or compete with his technical skill. Instead, he sang the song with such genuine emotion and vulnerability that he made Frank's earlier performance seem calculated and cold by comparison. The moment that defined the entire special came at the very end, when Frank and Elvis were supposed to shake hands and exchange pleasantries for the cameras. Frank extended his hand with the same cold smile he'd worn throughout the show, expecting Elvis to play along with the facade of mutual respect. But Elvis surprised him. Instead of shaking Frank's hand, the young singer pulled him into a genuine embrace, speaking quietly enough that the cameras couldn't pick up his words, but loudly enough for Frank to hear clearly. "Thank you for having me on your show, Mr. Sinatra. I hope someday we can do this again as friends instead of enemies." Frank's response, caught by the cameras and broadcast to 67 million Americans, was a moment of genuine surprise and confusion that revealed more about both men than hours of rehearsed performances had managed to do. For just a few seconds, America saw Frank Sinatra not as the confident chairman of the board, but as a middle-aged man who'd just been outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated. The reviews of the show were mixed for Frank, but overwhelmingly positive for Elvis. Critics praised the young singer's maturity, his professionalism, and his ability to hold his own alongside one of America's greatest entertainers. Frank's performance was described as workmanlike and lacking his usual spark. More importantly, the television ratings showed that Elvis's segments had drawn significantly higher viewership than Frank's solo performances, proving that the audience was more interested in the king of rock and roll than the chairman of the board. The aftermath of the special marked a turning point in both men's careers. Elvis went on to dominate the music industry throughout the 1960s, while Frank struggled to remain relevant in a musical landscape that increasingly belonged to younger performers who'd been inspired by Elvis's revolution. Frank never publicly admitted that Elvis had outperformed him on the special, but privately he began to change his approach to music and performance. He started incorporating more contemporary songs into his repertoire, working with younger arrangers and acknowledging that the musical world had changed in ways that required adaptation rather than resistance. Elvis, for his part, always spoke respectfully of Frank in interviews, crediting the older singer with teaching him important lessons about professionalism and stage presence. But he also made it clear that he'd learned those lessons not from Frank's example but from Frank's mistakes. The Welcome Home Elvis special became a watershed moment in American entertainment history, the night when the old guard officially passed the torch to the new generation, even though the old guard didn't realize it was happening at the time. If this untold story of backstage rivalry and generational conflict moved you, show your appreciation with a like, because sometimes the most legendary performances happen when two titans of entertainment wage war on national television. What do you think, was Frank right to defend his territory, or was Elvis justified in challenging the establishment? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the golden age of entertainment, where every collaboration was also a competition.